Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CDI Data Viz Collaboration Area. This is our quarterly webinar. And today we're hosting Lauren Tierney from the Washington Post to talk about mapping and data visualization at the Washington Post. For those of you who don't know me, I'm C. I use they, them pronouns. I'm one of the co-coordinators of this group, and I also lead the water data visualization team in the water mission area of USGS. Next slide. Okay, so just some reminders about how things are going to go today. Chat's always open. Feel free to share your reactions, ask questions, whatever you want in there. It's a friendly crowd. And especially during the webinar, and if you're not speaking, just please keep yourself on mute so we can try and just make sure everybody can hear what's going on. Okay, so what we've got planned today, right now we're in this first 5 minutes, just like a general welcome. We have a few announcements that we're going to share, and then we'll get right into the webinar, followed by a Q&A session at the end that everybody's welcome to participate in. And during that Q&A, you can either pop your questions in the chat. I'll try and keep track of that while Lauren's talking and compile those as they come in. You're also welcome to raise your hand, turn on your camera, or speak, and just talk to Lauren directly and ask whatever you're feeling. Okay, so what is CDI Data Viz? We are an open community for data visualization practitioners to gain exposure to different skills, tools, perspectives, and applications of data visualization. We also aim to act as a resource for data visualization best practices and guidelines in the federal government, which I think the majority of us are here working in the federal government, but also beyond. And the intention here is just to be a place to connect and learn with each other, engage over data visualization, and just grow together as a community. As a part of the CDI, we adhere to the CDI Code of Conduct. This applies to all participants in any events, as well as on our Teams channel. And the goal here is just to foster an open and welcoming environment for all. And so we do pledge, yeah, go ahead. Here's just some examples of what would be acceptable and unacceptable. In general, this is just intended to be an inclusive and welcoming place as far as the language and how we interact with each other, showing respect for everybody and their perspective. And then here, I think I'm going to pass it over to Dion.
Hey everyone, this is Dion Zawani with USGS Cloud Hosting Solutions. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I just have a few announcements for the community before we get started. First, please join us if you haven't yet on the CDI DataViz Microsoft team. There will be a few links dropped in the webinar chat for you to join us. If you are within the DOI, use the internal link, and if you are a member of the general public or otherwise outside of the department, you can use that external link that Amy will drop in. Once you join, you'll have access to our chat channels dedicated to creating and collaborating, networking, and sharing tips and tricks. Once you've joined us, feel free to tell us a little bit about yourself on our meet and greet channel, and then post one of your favorite vizzes if you like. We're always happy to meet new people and see what everyone is working on. We are recording today's webinar, and it will be shared through the listserv. You'll be notified via email and Microsoft Teams when it's ready to go. And just an FYI, our collaboration area, along with the rest of the CDI community, is still in the process of migrating our content to Microsoft SharePoint. Our group, the DataViz group, is getting close to completing the new site for you all. And then once that site goes live, you'll be able to use it to access past and future webinar information, as well as our various community resources. Also, as always, we encourage those of you who are passionate about DataViz and are interested in contributing ideas or feedback to reach out to any one of the planning team members if you'd like to join in our efforts. We would definitely love some fresh energy and perspective. All are welcome. We're a fun group to work with. Our contact information is posted on our old Confluence wiki, which will also be dropped in the chat. That's still live at the moment, and it'll also be available on the new SharePoint site as well. And then finally, next slide, please. I just wanted to share that there is an upcoming webinar within the CDI Data Management Working Group on publishing data visualizations. We're going to have folks on the line to discuss their own research workflows and challenges related to publishing final products. We're going to talk about publishing policy like FSP, 508 compliance, the USGS visual identity system, et cetera. And I'll be online talking with one of my colleagues about some of the services available to USGS employees in the cloud, like Tableau, our Studio Connect. And then we're also going to have someone on the line to talk about the USGS CMS. So this webinar is on September 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern, so please feel free to join. It's always great to, hop between groups and take advantage of the different collaboration areas CDI offers. That's all I had for announcements. We are going to jump into some very quick live community polling to kind of get us awake and moving and excited for the presentation today. So to join our live poll, you can scan the QR code with your camera app on your phone to join. That's probably the easiest. Or you can click the link in the Microsoft Teams chat. You can also go to Sli.do.com and enter the code CDI DataViz to join. Give everyone a second to get joined real quick. And our first question that's going live is just simply describe your summer in one word. Nearing the end of the summer now, sadly. Hectic. I think that's a trend this year. I'm not sure why. Family reunions going on, beer barbecue. Hot. I definitely feel that up here in Montana. We've had a very, very hot 3 weeks, but luckily no fires, which is very rare. Busy.
Hashtag DataViz. That seems like a good summer.
That sounds like a great summer.
Raves also sounds good.
Baby. Folks had babies this year. The emoji. I love that. Smoky. Not too much smoky, though. That's good. I love that. Tomato. I've been trying to grow a tomato plant all summer, and I finally have my first tomato. I'm a horrible gardener.
My tomatoes actually came in really late, and they're about to just explode everywhere.
Maybe it's just that kind of season. That gives me a little hope.
Late spring.
Right. Hot and busy and hectic across the board. Go ahead and move on to our next question, which is what development tools do you use to create maps? Are you using interactive dashboarding tools? Are you using custom development tools? If you do create maps, I should say. We are the USGS and our public collaborators, but ggplot, R, ArcGIS, kind of what is to be expected. Lauren, hopefully this also gives you an idea about what we're using here at USGS. Open source tools, QGIS. Yep. Tableau. I manage Tableau for the Bureau. I love to see that. Tableau and Python. Got some D3 in there. Like we're kind of slowing down pretty all across the board, I'd say. All right, our final question before I hand it back over to C is what do you struggle with most when creating maps? So what are your challenges? How can folks in our community help you out? Remembering to add a scale bar. Yeah, always. Color ramps, prepping data, not creating them enough. Unique aesthetics, data wrangling, data cleanup, data prep in general. What question does the map help with? Data availability, color selections. Lots of challenges. They're coming in fast. Creating the right map to tell a story. Maps are too boring visually, so creating an interesting, to the point map that gets the real point across.
I see like color selections for 508 compliance. Like I feel like I get stuck like trying to show kind of like maybe different data types and multiple things at once without like overwhelming in terms of color, and thinking that through tends to be where I spend a lot of my time personally.
And I know there's like that sweet spot for how many colors to use as well. All right, effective science communication. Again, color selections. Great. Well, we will save these. Give them a look over
Yes.
later. Thanks. Go ahead, Z.
It's good to no, I just say that it is actually, I am going to save that. It's good to know.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you, Dion. And so now I am thrilled to be introducing Lauren, who's going to be talking to us about mapping and data visualizations at the Washington Post. I'm aware of Lauren. I think she's pretty well known for her innovative cartographic work that's used to communicate science to broad audiences. She, in her current role, is a senior graphics reporter that focuses on mapping weather and natural disaster coverage. And prior to her current role, she was graphics editor for Nat Geo magazine. And so really excited to hear this talk. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let me get my screen share up and running. And I think we should be good to go. Let me see if I can get there we go. Okay, awesome. Just getting the chat up so I can see it just in case. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much all. I'm really excited to chat with you all today. And I just want to say like such a great intro to this talk too. It was great to hear like, you know, just that it's an inclusive group, just respect for presenter and for each other, and just a really great intro. So thank you all. I'm really excited to chat with you. And it was really cool to see all of the different like software and map challenges people have. Was really, really cool. So feel free to like, I'm happy to try to like answer questions on that at the end and stuff. And I'll try to point to some of those as we go through the talk. Yeah, so anyway, so thank you for the intro. My name's Lauren Tierney. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a senior graphics reporter at the Washington Post. I have been at the Post for almost 5 years now in November, which seems pretty wild. It doesn't feel like I've been there that long, but it's the longest job I've had, which is pretty wild. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mapping and data visualization in the Washington Post today, and how we do mapping and data viz on the Washington Post graphics team. So our team's about like almost 40 people now, which is really cool. And we've got kind of like a cross time zone team now as well. So we have some people in Europe. We have a lot of people on the East Coast in DC. I'm based with the DC office, and we actually have a West Coast team that is setting up as well. And so they're more remote, but a lot of people are in California, Oregon, and Washington, which is really cool. So our team's been growing a lot in the last couple of years, and just kind of reflects like the importance of data visualization for communicating data, information, journalism at the Post. And so I'll go give a little bit of background of how I got to where I am to start. Let's see here. So I am from the West Coast, so grew up California, Oregon, really lived on the West Coast my whole life until I moved to DC, so bounced around between California, Oregon, and also Alaska. I did my undergrad at University of Oregon, and I found a really roundabout way to journalism. So I started as a biology major. I loved sciences, but I also loved like writing and communication. And so I ended up starting biology. I switched to journalism. I got to journalism and I was like, well, this doesn't really feel like the right fit. Like I miss working with data. I miss working in science. And so I went back to biology. I added a second major, Spanish. I had been speaking Spanish for a while, and I wanted to improve on it, add in the literature component, and also like essentially have a backup plan, which was another dream was to become a Spanish teacher. So that was so worked on that double major. And so I was working through biology, taking a lot of those courses and the base science classes. And then for a gen ed requirement, I ended up taking a climatology class, and I absolutely loved it. It was so cool. I'd always been such a weather nerd growing up as a kid. Like, my favorite channel was Weather Channel, which sounds unbelievable, but I loved watching the Weather Channel, and like, what it was, like Weather on the 8 or something. Like, I loved seeing those updates. Anyway, so I found this climatology class, and I absolutely loved it. And it was offered through the geography program, and I didn't even know geography was a degree you could focus on in college. So I started taking more classes, and I ended up switching my major to geography. And I focused on physical geography because I could combine a lot of the sciences that I did for biology. So I took physics, I took chemistry, I took a lot of like upper level calculus classes to combine with that physical geography degree. But one of the requirements was taking GIS classes. And so I was just like on physical geography path, like taking all the climatology classes, biogeography classes I could. And then I took my first GIS course as a requirement. We were required to take 2. And the first one, not gonna lie, I was struggling. I was struggling really hard. It was like one of my least favorite geography classes, which in retrospect is interesting to think about. But I don't know, it's just something where it was like, it just didn't fully click. But the second GIS class that I had was taught by an instructor that really applied it in like the real world sense. So it wasn't just like, click this button to get this, click this button to get this. It was very much like, you can use information you learn in GIS and mapping and cartography to work in all these different areas and work with all these different data sets and communicate all these different things, and communicating data as information. And it just clicked. Like, I think it clicked to the side of my, interest and wanted to work with data, but also that communicating aspect from the journalism sense. So like, I came to this in a really roundabout way. And so I ended up, I had applied to, I was actually going on the atmospheric sciences track for grad school afterwards. And so by the time I came across this GIS class and things started to click, and I started taking cartography classes, et cetera, I'd already applied to grad school. I was set to go to like an atmospheric sciences program. And it was really the senior year of taking a lot of GIS and cartography that I ended up putting that grad school on hold to essentially reapply and focus on more GIS and cartography. And so my senior year I went through a lot of paths, which I like to share, because I feel like when I entered college, it was like, oh, like, you shouldn't change majors, like stick with one thing. And I am so glad that I bounced around, and I just give people the advice of like, just explore, like figure out what kind of clicks. And so I ended up staying on at University of Oregon for grad school. After I reapplied, I focused on GIS, and we didn't have like a cartography tenure track professor. So my master's thesis was more focused on GIS, spatial analysis, and modeling. So rather than the cartography side, but I stayed there. So I was in Eugene for quite a while. And then it was in my grad school program that I started going to conferences. I went to the North American Cartographic Information Society conference, which is it's an annual conference. It goes by NACIS, and it's a cartography conference that it was just really cool. There were a lot of people from the federal government. There were a lot of people from private industry, from journalism, et cetera, that were coming to this conference, and got to meet a lot of people there. And through that and networking and meeting people at the conference, ended up sending some job applications, and one of those was National Geographic. National Geographic, I applied when I was almost done with grad school. I was able to get like an assistant position there, essentially cartographic assistant, so helping a lot of the senior editors with their maps and fine tuning and spell checks and accuracy checks, et cetera. And so near the end of my grad program, I went to National Geographic, finished up my thesis from DC, and I worked at National Geographic for about 3 years. I started out as a cartographic assistant, then I moved to the Atlas and Books division, making maps as an editor on that side. So making a lot of the maps that would appear in books and the different atlases that National Geographic produces. And then for the last year I was there, I moved back to the magazine side and worked as a graphics editor, working on the maps that go in the magazine on a monthly basis. And so I was there for about 3 years. And then in 2017, I moved to the Washington Post. And I like to share this whole journey because essentially like I had a brief interest in journalism and then like went all the way to maps, and then like I never would have expected that maps could have led me to the Washington Post. Like if undergrad Lauren knew that, like I wouldn't, or had heard that, like I wouldn't have believed it. And so it's just I like to share this journey, and that like, you know, you can kind of bounce around to find the right fit and find what you want. And so so I work at the Washington Post. This is really briefly, when I was at University of Oregon, I also worked at the infographics lab in the geography department. So the main project I worked on there was this Atlas of Wyoming's ungulates, which was an amazing project and like instilled a love for wildlife mapping that I just can't let go of. I love mapping GPS data, wildlife data, etc. And so I worked on this product for a couple years in end of undergrad and then grad school. So I worked in the lab getting that kind of like real world cartography experience, especially since my master's thesis was not focused on the cartography sense. And then just a few samples from National Geographic. This was a magazine piece focusing on an area of northern Russia, a couple other projects from National Geographic. One of my favorite, these are really just two of my favorite projects I got to work on, was a project on mapping Antarctica. I worked with a freelance cartographer on this one as well, and partnered together to make like a digital piece, etc. And then on the right is a map of British Columbia that National Geographic doesn't do these as often anymore, but they used to have like way more of the like fold out posters. They're called supplements. And so this was one of those like posters you would fold out of the magazine. And both of these projects were about like 6-month efforts from like initial research to sending it to the printers. Not every project was like that on the magazine, but usually they were like a couple months, if it was really tight turnaround, a couple weeks, but definitely a different timeline than at the Washington Post. So at the Washington Post, when I first started, I was like, oh my goodness, everything's going to be breaking news. This is going to be exciting, but it's probably going to be stressful. And there are times where it is stressful, but it's not all breaking news. Like obviously we have to map and do data viz for a lot of stuff focused on the news, breaking news, but also get to work on a lot of multi-week projects. There have also been like multi-month projects as well. I'd say probably the longest has been 4 months, so not quite the like 6-month projects of National Geographic, but things work at a little different pace at the Washington Post. But personally, I like it. I like having like the really quick maps to do and having those long-term projects. It's nice to have that balance, at least for kind of the workflow I enjoy. So I'm going to go over just how we cover the news with maps. First, I'm going to start off with kind of the different tiers of map making we do at the Post, and it kind of follows that track of like timeline. So those breaking news maps of like, we need a map in the next 30 minutes to an hour, we need a map in a couple hours to a day, and then something that's maybe like a couple days, couple weeks, or a week, couple weeks, month, etc. So I'm going to go through kind of like how we break down these different scales of mapping and time scales of mapping the news, and then also go through some of our like different topics that we cover as well, which is a lot because the news covers a lot. And National Geographic, it was a lot of like environment, climate, archaeology. Those were some of the main ones, wildlife, and we definitely cover all of those at the Washington Post too, but along with like politics and a lot of breaking news stuff as well. So the first phase of map, like when we're thinking about breaking news maps, is where did it happen? And this is essentially like the quickest locator map you can make. So like if a breaking news event happens, it seems like it could use a map. It would be helpful for readers to have a map. That is like the locator that we're going to make. We try to keep it within a 30-minute to an hour range. And we have a variety of tools to help with this. We use a tool called Data Wrapper to make locator maps, which is really helpful. We used to use a program called Maps for News, but also because we've done so many news maps, we have a lot of like maps saved in our archive that we can like update styles and whatnot. So Oftentimes we have a map. If something happens in Toronto, if something happens in Denver, we often have like a city level map of that that's made within the last couple of years, or 5 years, 6 years, that we can repurpose. Not always, but that's kind of where we start before making it from scratch. So this phase one is like, where did it happen? And the example I'm going to use for this first one is just like mapping a hurricane. So this is from our hurricane tracker, and this is like a wind history for Hurricane Ida because it already happened. But normally this tracker will show you like where it's going to go, etc. And this one's just wind history, but essentially like where did it happen? Where is it happening? So this shows you've got the states, you've got a couple of location cities, you've got dates and time following along this path to essentially help the reader place, where is this happening? How far is this from me, etc. And so this is that like really quick map. This one happens to be our tracker, but I'll show another example that's not a tracker or like a digital map, or not a digital map, not an interactive map, but is more static. The second phase is like what happened, what is happening. So this is like locator plus thematic information, I like to think of it. So this is something maybe we try to put out within a couple hours, within a day, within a couple days. Just essentially that similar information to that map I showed previously, but with thematic information that might be helpful to readers to understand what's going on, how they might be affected, how the area might be affected. So following that Hurricane Ida theme, this is an example of that kind of locator map plus thematic data that's a little bit longer time frame. So this one shows potential storm surge flooding data for Hurricane Ida. So we're still showing like that projected path, but it's also showing storm surge flooding as well. We've also got information on populated areas, leveed areas, etc., to help provide more context to that location. And it's not that we, wait to make the locator map until this is here. We try to like do a lot of this mapping in phases. Like first get the locator map out. Okay, people know where it is. Now let's explore what thematic information we can put on there. So sometimes that first locator map gets replaced. Sometimes this map gets added to the story that one is accompanying as well, just to give that extra level of data. And then for phase three, it's what else helps the reader understand what happened or what is happening. So if an event is going on, this might be a more like multi-day or multi-week project that's just showing like some more thematic information, more contextual information, maybe a compare and contrast, bringing a lot of other different data viz maps, etc. And this is very focused on maps, but this is kind of a similar process to some of the data viz stuff we do too, is like, what's the quickest thing we can do? And then how do we elevate it? And then how do we elevate it again with more time once we've kind of given the readers initial context? And so following that theme of Hurricane Ida, one thing that was happening in the news is a lot of people were comparing it to Katrina. Like, how does this compare to Katrina? And like, we just didn't really see a map of that. And so my colleagues, Laris and Bonnie, put together this project essentially comparing Ida and Katrina. And as you can see, they have very different characteristics. This was a project that published a couple days after the storm passed, because it was still in the news, obviously, there was a lot of electrical outages, there were a lot of flooding, there was a lot of people impacted, and Hurricane Katrina kept getting thrown out. And so my colleagues, they put together this piece over a couple days and just comparing the two storms using different data to compare. So this is that kind of like, what else can we provide? How can we compare and contrast? And it's like it's on a longer time frame. And then another example showing this phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of mapping. Phase 1, this is that, locator map, like what's happening, where is it happening? So this was a fire near Lake Tahoe. And this one's just showing like the firm's VIIRS data on this map. And it's just showing, okay, here's some cities near it. There's Sacramento. We've got Tahoe City, Carson City, showing past fire activity as well. And so this is something we're trying to put out really quickly, just so people know, like, okay, I keep hearing about this fire. Where is this fire? How close is it to Tahoe, etc. Phase 2, this is a different fire. This is the Dixie Fire. So we didn't do kind of like a phase 2 project for this for the Caldor fire, but this is an example of like a phase 2 map that we would do for covering a wildfire. So showing like how fast it is spreading and the extent to where it's spreading. So this one again is the Dixie fire, but is an example of something that would be kind of that phase 2 map. This is a bit more time intensive phase 2 map. So this wasn't something done in a couple hours, but it could be if the base was simpler. But as you can see, like the base map has like a lot of details that took definitely days or weeks to do. But in terms of like representing like speed and time, this is kind of like a phase two map. And then phase 3, so this is something where it's, so phase 3, so this is something that was actually put out like after a lot of these fires had been going on for a while. So you see the Caldor fire, you see the Dixie fire, just to give context to how much smoke is billowing across the U.S. And with this one, this was a longer term project, so a couple days, about a week, I think. And there was just so much talk about the smoke in the sky. And I heard people mentioning at the beginning of the meeting, you know, like it's smoky or it's not smoky or not as smoky as last year. And so this was a way of representing that smoke from the fire. So a bit longer project, but giving more context to like how the fires are affecting the West. And in a previous map of this too, a lot of the smoke even made it over to the East Coast as well. So those are the different phases of how we map and cover the news at the Washington Post. Very simplified. There's obviously a lot of different cases, but when a news event happens, those 3 phases are kind of how we boil down. Like, what's the quickest thing we can make? What can we add to that quick map to provide context? And then a little bit deeper dive of how do we help readers better understand the impact of what's going on? So comparing it to the hurricane to Katrina, comparing or looking at how smoke from these fires is impacting huge swaths of the country. And so now I'll go through kind of the different topics and different types of maps we do. Locator maps, these are going to be ones that are in that like phase 1, phase 2 category of very, very simple, quick locator maps, but also locator maps with some thematic information. So we do a lot of locator maps. We do them at all different scales. So on the left is a map that is for like our real estate section. So it's not always like breaking news, we have to respond. We also have like a real estate section where it's local DC, Maryland, Virginia real estate articles about different neighborhoods. And so each week we map one of these neighborhoods. So giving context to where DC is, where it's near parks and different interstates, etc. So that's kind of what we'd call like a street level map or near street level map. This one's a little bit more zoomed out. But street level map, and then another one we do a lot is kind of these state or country level locator maps. So this was for a story that just, you know, the authors were writing about Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus, and they wanted to show just how close together these countries are. We use Data Wrapper, which is that online program that I mentioned before. Happy to answer questions about that. But we use that a little bit more for these types of locator maps now. But these ones were made starting from like QGIS and then being brought into Illustrator. And I'd say a lot of the maps we do go from QGIS to Illustrator using Photoshop, etc. In terms of tools on the team, all of the tools you all listed are all used by at least one or many people on the team. So I personally use QGIS, Illustrator, Photoshop a lot, but a lot of people use R, a lot of people use Python, D3, etc. And so everyone, we don't have like set rules on like you must use this tool. It's like, you know, we have map styles. We want to do cool maps and like use the tools that you feel comfortable with. Use the tools that you think could add a lot to the story. So a lot of different tools. This is a map I made a while back. This is kind of like that phase 2 locator map. So this one took a bit more time, but essentially it was locating the Alaska Lawn Trail. And if this needed to be done like really, really quickly, could have just drawn the trail on there, having the background information, a few cities, and done. But reading the story, and because I had some time before the story published, wanted to add some other context. So adding national forests, national parks, making sure to include like national wildlife refuges, etc. to essentially give context to all of the different natural areas that, well, it's Alaska, there's a lot of natural areas, but like essentially the protected natural areas that are along this trail from Seward to Fairbanks. And so this is kind of like a longer term locator map, but the purpose is to locate the Alaska Lawn Trail. This is one that we did, oh my goodness, I lose track of time so much, but last year, beginning of this year, when the volcano exploded in Tonga, we did a variety of maps for this, but essentially we started with just a locator map of Tonga, where is it in the Pacific, and where is this volcano? And then my coworker Laris added the top time series of satellite images, so the 1, 2, 3 of how it essentially disappeared. And so that was like in part 2 add. So it's the same map, but added those satellite imagery like a day after, not a day after, but like a couple days after. And so added that to that. And then a lot of people were having questions about like, is this on the Ring of Fire? Where is it? So we produced this other map. Laris put this together of the Ring of Fire. And so this one locator map evolved a lot to include a lot of different things and then a lot of different contexts. Really, the Ring of Fire could go on the locator map, on the globe locator map that's on the locator map as well too. But this is an example of a locator map that evolved as more information came to be and also more reader questions, etc. And then this is a map from actually a couple days ago or last week. This river, it's more informally known as the Yauk out in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And the local team was working on a story about how there were big plans to build hiking trails along this river, but actually those hiking trails may potentially damage the river. And so they wanted to locate where the river was, where it fell in this watershed. And this one, I had so much fun making this map, and I'm going to nerd out for a second because like I love NHD plus data, and I love working with like stream order and stuff. And so like anytime a river map comes up, I'm like, yes, like I'm so excited. We don't always get such like more fun maps, and so anytime river stuff comes up, I get really excited. So anyway, I nerded out for a second, but this is like a locator map. The goal was to locate the river, and that's what this does, and provides a little bit of extra context with the watershed and a few story names that were in the story. But yeah, so another example of a locator map. This was like a couple day turnaround, so this wasn't like a breaking news thing, but a couple day turnaround map. We also work a lot with satellite imagery on our team as well. We use it there. It appeared a couple times, as you saw in some of those locator maps. We use it for locator maps. We use it for like main pieces in the story. We also use it from like an analysis part too. So sometimes satellite imagery or remote sensing data isn't used in a map form, but maybe data from that is being used for other graphics and data visualizations as well. So so we use satellite imagery a lot. We use it from public sources, so from government sites, and then also we work with like Maxar and Planet imagery a lot as well for getting like really close up stuff. So this is a project. This is using Planet imagery. This was for a piece looking at the drought in the West. This piece is a couple months old now, so I'm guessing the satellite imagery has undergone even more change. But this is one where it's we worked with Planet to work with the satellite imagery, but it's a satellite imagery kind of turned into map. So it has just a few map labels just to give a little bit of context, adding a scale bar. And so these are helpful for us when we need to do really quick turnarounds too. I mean, this would be an amazing area to do hill shade and whatnot. And it really is a cool area to map, but sometimes we need to move faster than we're able to create this like really intricate hill shade for the map. And so satellite imagery can be helpful, especially if like, making our own hill shade isn't very critical to the story, but showing how much the water is depleted in this area is the main part. So this is an example of using satellite imagery. This is just like a GIF format, compare and contrast. This is like a similar format. So this is a reservoir in Mexico. Myself and one of our Capital Weather Gain reporters, Kasha Patel, she wrote a story on the drought in Mexico, and we worked with Planet on the satellite imagery as well. And this this is one that it's using that similar like GIF style as the previous one. We actually ended up only using the GIF for like a social media promo, and for the inside map ended up using the satellite imagery as like a map base. So again, this is something where it could have built the map with like the population areas, the buildings, etc. But because the shoreline change was so drastic, essentially worked with the satellite imagery as a map base to help annotate and communicate the big change between the 2021 and 2022 shoreline. So we had like multiple representations of this same area. So in the original story, we had like a side-by-side of the satellite imagery. For social media, we had like a GIF going back and forth, and then further down the piece, this more explanatory map, so that hopefully readers can have more time to explore it versus kind of like scrolling through Twitter. And then this is a piece that my coworker Hannah Dormito made last year. This was looking at Mount Shasta, and so this is kind of that, it's like satellite imagery, remote sensing mixture where obviously snow is not like cyan blue on Mount Shasta, but essentially using remote sensing to essentially pull out those snow areas to better help highlight the amount of snow, lack of snow on Mount Shasta, because it's a mountain, sun angles, there's like some areas in shadow, and so essentially the goal was to better highlight the snow or lack of snow on the mountain. So satellite imagery plus map labels plus essentially pulling out the snow to better highlight it for readers. This one was also done with Kasha Patel with Capital Weather Gain, which is our like weather, meteorology, climate team, which we work with a lot on the map side. Washington Post, we obviously do a lot of political coverage, political mapping. And so for elections, whether that's midterm elections, presidential elections, local elections, just a lot of elections coverage, and that's where a lot of our readers come to the Washington Post for election and politics coverage, being in the nation's capital. And so we do a variety of politics maps. So we obviously do like the voting results map. So this is an example from the Virginia governor election, showing essentially, which areas are red and blue, and then how big the red and blue shifts were. And so this is something that is live on election night. People can come back to and check. And so we do this for a variety of elections and in different ways. So it's a lot of work goes into building this product for an election night, but it's something that's like very much like following the breaking news of like what's happening with the election. We also do some of these pieces. This is by my coworkers Tim, Joe, and Dan, and we do these pieces where it's kind of that follow-up analysis. So it's not just the election results, but it's like how have the election results changed. So this is like this political wins piece that they did, and it shows how it's using, I don't know if you all have seen, I forget the source, but maybe someone can post it in the chat if they remember, but there's this like wind map that you can explore the globe, and it has these like wind lines, and that was kind of like their dream, was to have like a politics map that had that like wind flow of like, the change going left to right, et cetera. And like, I love this map key. I love unique map keys, and I think they did like a really, really cool job with this one. So it's not all just like, the results, but also like interpreting the results in different creative ways. Thank you for sharing, Wendy. I appreciate it. And then also different ways for understanding politics. So this is one that my coworkers Dylan and Joe made. This is essentially like playing mini golf to understand redistricting. So redistricting has been a big topic for us. And so Dylan and Joe created this game of essentially understanding redistricting through mini golf. So like Wyoming, for example, is the state shape. So it's nearly square. But then as you go through the game, it gets more difficult as you get to more complex districts and geography, and it keeps score and all that. And so it's a really interesting one. And the goal of this was to essentially help people better understand redistricting and the complicated boundaries that go into that. A big project for us last year was the 2020 census. That still goes on, like still working with that data. Maybe some of you all have worked with the census data as well. And this was one where we did kind of like different levels of data analysis. So we had this project that came out like the day that the data was released, and this was something that like we knew when the census data was going to be released, so we prepped it ahead of time. But this was just kind of like a across the country overview of how demographic groups have changed across the country. Looking at the 2020 census data allows you to hover and kind of gives like a broad analysis of how the country has changed. The project that we published the day after, that was many months in the making with test data and whatnot ahead of the data release, was this piece looking at where you can look up your address, your zip code, to see how demographics have changed in your area since the 1990 census. So you can see how demographics have changed by zip code. You can look up all kinds of different geography. This was one that was a long time in the making, but we wanted to make something that readers could find themselves in the census data. And at the bottom, this one's using Mapbox, but essentially pan and zoom and explore like how the neighborhoods, how your neighborhood has changed, but also how the surrounding area. Maybe you want to check out a different neighborhood where you grew up, where your parents live, etc. So we wanted to provide a way for readers to explore the data going back to 1990. Another big area of coverage we have is foreign. So foreign, we have bureaus all over the world. We have a lot of reporters working on different pieces across the globe. And so our graphics team works with foreign a lot for various things, whether it's breaking news, etc. This is a piece that my coworkers Dylan and Julia worked on about Africa's rising cities. This was like a multi-month project. So this was one that was like longer term. It's not around breaking news, but just like exploring the data of like how Africa's cities are changing across the continent, and what that population increase is looking like, both in map form and data viz. So this one is looking at the world's 100 most populous cities. This one is looking at essentially the land footprint of Lagos. And then Dylan also did these really cool, this was using Blender, I believe, but essentially looking at the population density for different cities. And so as you can see, like a lot of this is looking at, it's similar data across each, but it's giving you a different lens. So like this is the footprint of the city. This is showing like the different population density. So rather than showing the data in one way, showing the data in multiple ways throughout the story for different focus cities. This year has been a big year for covering Ukraine for obvious reasons, and we've been covering it in a couple different ways. So obviously that is ongoing. So we continue to cover it and map it. But one of the things that we did in the beginning before war officially broke out was essentially providing context of like, you know, what is the history of Ukraine and Russia since the Soviet Union. So showing where the former Soviet Union boundary is. Also showing NATO member states, so where Ukraine's in this middle area. Also showing these different separatist controlled areas, so Crimea, which was annexed back in 2014, and different areas in the region, just to provide like, you know, essentially like an FAQ for readers of like, you know, what's going on here, what is the historical context, like what is the geographical context in this area. And so we've been doing a lot with Ukraine coverage. Even covering, you know, there continues to be a lot of cities thrown out in the news when different things happen in the war. And so giving context, you know, just even the size of Ukraine, like how big is Ukraine compared to the US, compared to different states, also comparing a couple different cities. This is one that is static, so it's not so much reader focused of like where you can see, you know, if you live on the West Coast, like the East Coast, for instance, it's just showing East Coast and then a few sample cities. And the reason being that this one isn't as interactive, like placing in a location that you were familiar with. It's just like the quick timeline. So this is something that we wanted to get out quick, and sometimes interactive is not a quick option to do. And so using satellite imagery to provide kind of example footprints compared to various U.S. cities for the U.S. readership. And then another piece that we did was essentially the physical geography of Ukraine. So and human geography, but looking at the different aspects in Ukraine, around Ukraine, that would potentially play a role in a Russian invasion. So this was published before the war broke out, and it was essentially trying to give context to why is this going on? Like what pieces are here that are contributing to this conflict? So with Crimea, with Chernobyl, with Belarus, etc. And so this was just an image. So this was like one image, the pan and zoomed and turn on and off different layers. So it was all like powered by JPEGs essentially, which was a lot of maps, but I think it helped kind of like focus readers. But and then this map is obviously old, it's back from March, but we continue to map Russian-held areas and different conflict areas. And as news develops, we continue to create more maps, and we continue to update our control map and et cetera as things goes on. So sometimes these things, they start out as breaking news or potential news, and then so we cover them ahead of time to give readers context. We cover the breaking news, and then we continue to cover and map and visualize the different data as it becomes available. We do a lot of weather and natural disasters. I already shared a lot of these in the beginning with the locator map side, but some recent ones we've done. So there's been a lot of dry, hot conditions in Europe, and so been working with. This is a data set that I started working with this year, and it's really cool. But it's essentially like oh my goodness, we changed the headline on this one, but it's like the evaporation index. Sorry, there's another map that has the actual data title on it. But yeah, so we've been using this data a lot. We used it for a couple other drought stories to essentially show just how dry things are. And so this has been a data set that I've been learning to work with this year. We published this a few weeks ago. This one was one that there was extreme rainfall in North and South Korea a few weeks ago. And so this was a map where it became really big news overnight. And so made this map. This one was probably an hour or 2 hour map. So it's very it doesn't have hill shade. It doesn't have a lot of things, but it's just giving context to essentially the total precipitation in this area that was really, really hard hit. And then this is a project from last year from former colleague Zach Levitt, who he's at the New York Times now. And he did this piece on essentially looking at the extreme weather from last year and ranging from smoke to heat to cold waves to hurricanes, et cetera. And so we worked with a ton of different data sets to bring together these animations. So going throughout the whole year. So the extreme cold that hit at the beginning of last year. This is the fire again. So the one I shared earlier was just a little snapshot, but this is an animation of essentially Dixie fire smoke blowing across. I heard Montana mentioned, et cetera, but a lot of you probably experienced a lot of this smoke. It even reached all the way to DC as well. So animating that. And then also using satellite imagery. So I mentioned satellite imagery. We use that a lot too. And so mapping the tornado path that happened at the end of last year, and essentially showing where it went through this town in Kentucky, and it went through many, many states. But this was one of the examples of the map. And then just big maps. Sometimes we just do big maps. So. So for big maps, these are usually multi-week, multi-month projects, usually partnering with a different desk on the newsroom. So it could be similar to ones I've shared before: elections, foreign, climate, weather, national, etc. But sometimes they're graphics department pitch. So this was one from a couple years ago, looking at the U.S.-Mexico border, and essentially it is as advertised, big map, but essentially going the entire length of the U.S.-Mexico border and describing different points of interest along there, the different fence types. That was the news pitch at the time, was the proposed fencing along the border. And so that was a big project from a couple years ago. This one is from last year or the year before, but this is by my coworker Laris, so I mentioned. This one is mapping the Nile River and the watershed, and if you may have realized, it is north is not up, and so it's following the river downstream all the way down to Cairo. I love this map, and Laris is a big fan of like rotating the map, so north isn't up, which I think when you're following a river flows is a really cool way to do it. And then this is a project from a couple years ago. This was with my coworker Joe. We were mapping fall leaves, and so we were working with some cool data sets and satellite imagery to essentially map fall colors across the country based on like tree species. So we worked with Descartes Labs, who was doing a lot of satellite imagery stuff and showing how like the colors pop up over time, and then doing a couple of like satellite imagery examples of the different colors. And so this one, in the Northeast, we also did one was in Alaska, so showing like the reds, the oranges, and also the yellows of more like aspen, etc. So those are just some examples of like big map projects that are like multi-week, multi-month projects that have like a lot of maps or like one big map. And those are kind of those longer term ones that aren't always like right off of the breaking news, but more of like that exploring the news. And to end, this presentation is obviously being focused a lot on maps. Maps is more of what I do, but like on the graphics team, we do 3D models, we do animations, we do illustrations, data viz, graphics, etc. And so a lot of this has been on maps, and I love maps very much. But I'm a strong believer that not everything has to be a map. And so I'm just going to share a couple of examples of like graphics that could have been maps, but glad that they aren't maps, because I think that they help readers a bit better. So this is one that was done, this project was done by my coworkers Hannah and Laris, and they were mapping essentially major hurricanes that made landfall in 2020 and 2021. And this is an example of one that is a map and a chart. And so when mapping hurricanes, it's obviously a lot of squiggly lines, which doesn't mean that you can't map or you shouldn't map it, but sometimes it's helpful to have like the same data on a chart too to help support. So the map is there to essentially remind people of like, okay, this is where Ida was, this is where Laura was, Delta, etc. And color coding them by major hurricane, tropical storm, but then providing a chart with essentially the same data but extended further back in time to show and compare the number of major hurricanes back to past years. This chart could have been those lines for every year on the map. It would have probably been a bit chaotic and maybe not as helpful to the reader. And so having like a map to show like recent hurricanes, and then having a chart to go through further back in time, just to kind of help the reader better grasp like the compare and contrast, like what's happened over time, etc. And like I said, the chart on the right could have been a map, but I think it's more helpful not as a map. And this is one that I worked on a couple years ago. I was going to make a map. I was going to make a world map. There were going to be arrows going everywhere of essentially remittance flows between countries. And like I half started the map. I should have added the like screenshot of it. I have it somewhere to this presentation, but I got like halfway through highlighting countries, and I was like, well, a lot of these countries are small, but a lot of these small countries have like the most amount of like remittances coming in, and so it didn't seem to like represent it properly. And so what I ended up doing was just organizing the labels in a roughly geographic way, and then having like these flow arrows of money going to and from. And so this is one that like I started the map, like it's half done somewhere in my files, and then I was like, this isn't helping me, and so I don't think it's going to help help readers. And so then also for that story was this one where, again, it could have been arrows flowing into India where the countries are. But I thought for the story, it was more important to show like how much money coming from, like ordering by how much money versus like locating, necessarily locating the country. So just the examples of like, maps are wonderful. I love maps, but not everything has to be a map just because it's like, it's country data or state data, et cetera. There's so many cool ways to do like little data viz and charts and stuff. So yeah, and that's my presentation. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for joining. Let me know if you have any questions. And if you have to run or something, my email address, I forgot to add it here, but it's lauren.tierney@washpost.com. So feel free to email if you've got to jump. So thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And everybody, if you want to join me in turning on your mics and just giving Lauren a round of applause here.
Oh, thank you all.
Awesome. That was really cool to see all of those projects. And I really also enjoyed, and I think other people in the chat really enjoyed like hearing about your pathway to how you got to where you are now. That was really interesting.
Awesome.
So I think we can just kick off the Q&A session now. So I welcome anybody that has any questions or anything that they want to say to Lauren to either pop them in the chat or raise your hand and you can ask her directly. And I can start off with one that I saw come in the chat a little bit earlier from Mike. Mike said, how do you handle map look as they move from short-term to more long-term projects?
Can you repeat that? Map look?
Yeah, like I'm guessing this means like just like the appearance of the map as it evolves, like from maybe something that was shorter term and becomes like a bigger project.
Yeah, that's a good question. So one thing that helps kind of keep those style consistencies as they change is just like our map and design style. So we have 2 fonts that we use for maps, which I think is funny because at National Geographic there were like 10 fonts for maps, and sometimes I miss it, but sometimes I'm like, it's nice just to have 2. And so I'm on the fence about that. But you know, keeping the same font style. We also have like a color scheme that we use more for charts and stuff, because maps, like a lot of people said in concerns about, you know, making sure things are like legible and colorblind friendly and stuff. And sometimes we have to adjust for the map just because there's so many things going on, so many different shapes versus like a bar chart, etc. And need to pull from more colors. And so style things like keeping the same symbols, fonts, etc. really help with that. But sometimes stuff needs to get dropped off. So sometimes maybe that first locator map is a satellite image because it's the quickest thing we can work with. But then maybe a couple hours later the next day, we realize, hey, like actually hillshade would be more helpful to readers than this satellite imagery. And so sometimes things get tossed or like turned off in Illustrator layers, which is what we use quite a bit. And so sometimes it gets turned off and replaced, but then, you know, if you're changing from satellite imagery to hillshade, then you've obviously got to revisit your, you know, are the labels still legible? And so it's still going through these checks and balances of like, can I still read everything that's on this map? Can I still tell what the most, like the hierarchy? So what is the most important thing on this map or data viz? And then like going down from there in terms of like how much something is like really popping or brightness or saturation or boldness, et cetera. And so it's a constant like revisiting when we have to like update those maps and stuff, because we still need to make sure it's legible. We still need to make sure the hierarchy makes sense so that the thing that we want, the thing that's the most important thing on the map or the most related to like the story or the news topic is the most visible, bold thing on the map. Yeah.
I'm curious, what are the 2 fonts?
Yeah, it's Franklin. They're like, I don't know if they're like I think they're like they're the fonts, but like adjusted slightly for like, or like licensed slightly for like post style. But it's Franklin and Franklin for sans serif, and then the serif is Miller. So it's pretty much mostly sans serif and then Miller's for water. So, which is like, sometimes I wish there was just one more font for physical geography labels, but I usually just do italics for those. Yeah, or not, that is our style, is to do italics. So, yeah.
Okay, there's a question here from Florence in chat, and I'll add a little bit in the beginning because I have a similar question. I'm just wondering, I'm curious, like, how big is the team that you work with? And then Florence is also adding, like, how do you divide the work? Do you have people that specialize on data acquisition and prep and others that focus on biz, or what's the team dynamic like?
Yeah, it kind of changed. It has to be very like dynamic just based on how fast we need to move. And also, like, you know, we could be working on long-term projects and then in an hour some big news event happens and we need to like drop everything and go. And so we have a team of almost 40 people now, so it's pretty big, and it's a very horizontal team structure. So there's we have a director, deputy director, we have assignment editors, I think about 6 or 7 that are kind of like, you know, they're assigning things out, they're editing content, etc. So are the director and deputy director, but more, you know, they're doing kind of the managing lead and stuff. And then we have like a whole bunch of reporters. And so that's where I fit in, is the reporter side. And so the reporter's main thing is like making things, doing data analysis, etc. And I say like making things, and that sometimes that's illustrations, sometimes that's charts, sometimes that's doing like coding development for an interactive project, interactive map. We have a small group of cartographers that focuses cartography, but even that differs. So we have cartographers that work more in like Illustrator, Photoshop, and QGIS and whatnot. We have cartographers that work more in D3 and Mapbox and Leaflet, Python, R. And so we have, but I mentioned this at the beginning, is like, it doesn't necessarily matter like not the software tool, but like what you're doing with the software. So like, use the software you're comfortable with, always try new things, but it's more of like that kind of like putting stuff together. And so in terms of dividing the work, if it's breaking news, that kind of like phase 1 I was talking about, it's pretty much like who is available. And so say something happens and it's the assignment editors are like, okay, we need a cartographer, we need someone to do data analysis, and we need someone to like make some charts. Like, they're gonna look for the people with those skill sets and see who's the most available. But if there's no one readily available, then it's like, okay, like, you know, Lauren, drop that project, like, we need you on this. And that is okay, because working in a newsroom, it's like, I might be working on a long-term project that, you know, I can pick up when this news event is done, or if that long-term project is about to publish, like, it's thankfully pretty understood in the newsroom, where it's, you know, my manager will go to that story team and be like, this news thing happened, Lauren needs to be pulled off of this for a bit. And so they'll like push back like the publish date if they're able to, so that to allow for that. So it's just being very dynamic based on like the news, because every day is kind of unexpected. And then for longer term projects, it comes down to, you know, who's available, also people's interests. So I really like wildlife stuff, and climate and weather, obviously. And so oftentimes, like, my manager will be like, you know, hey, Lauren, do you want to work on this? We've got other people that have different interests. Also, sometimes it's a volunteer aspect. So my manager will ask, you know, the group of cartographers, hey, we have this map. Like, is anyone interested in this? And like, someone who you may not have thought had an interest in that is interested. And so it's it's very, very different, but it's depending on the case, but it's very open in like conversation. Like, say I get assigned something where I'm like, I don't have the skill set to do this, or like, I'm not as knowledgeable about this, but maybe this other person is. Like, we have to be very communicative and like dynamic to be able to like kind of cover everything and be ready for like, you know, random things. And like right now, like, it's hurricane season, and so it's like we've kind of all got like a little bit of bandwidth left over for like whenever like more hurricane news comes in, that like we can jump to that. So there's some things we know are coming, and other things, and so we can kind of prepare for time-wise, or not commit to too many maps or projects. But some stuff just happens out of the blue. Yeah.
what sort of time scale do those like longer term projects happen over?
Yeah, I'd say a couple months. Like, I think the longest one I've worked on was like 4 months. I think the investigatives team at the Post, they work on stuff sometimes for a year, a couple years, but it doesn't always make it to graphics until like maybe the last couple months, just because they don't have all the data yet, or they haven't conducted all the interviews, et cetera. It's still very much in like the reporting stage. And so sometimes the other desk will work on these things for a much longer time. But I think the longest I've worked on something is about 4 months. And that comes from just like learning about the story, exploring the data, doing separate research, looking for inspiration, trying to figure out what data is missing, what do we need, and then all the way to the end of like making the final product that's going to go on the website and potentially in the print paper later. Yeah.
Okay, I got another question from the chat here. What is your process for map planning? Do you sketch out ideas, storyboard, or do you just start building?
Yeah, this one is a lot of sketching. I used to do more sketching when I was at National Geographic, and I think that's just because there was like more time a little bit. Like sometimes we need a map so fast, like if a big urgent breaking news things happens, like I don't have time to sketch it. I just need to like start making it. And so I just like QGIS almost becomes my sketchboard. And so it's like I just throw in like different shape files, different data, and I'm not designing in QGIS, but I'm just like putting all the things I think I'll need. And then I can always delete it later, either in QGIS or turn off in Illustrator, etc. But for not like very, very urgent breaking news ones, I love to sketch stuff out, or just even like screenshot different like color samples or texture samples. Sometimes I'll just draw it in like a little like inspiration folder or something. Pre-pandemic, definitely used to sketch more on like whiteboards and stuff. I've gotten back into it, but it was like without a whiteboard, I kind of was like, I mean, I have plenty of paper and pencils around, but like I just got out of the habit because I wasn't like talking through it. But last year I was a manager on the team, and like I would just, with my reporters, I would just like draw something out and I just like hold it up to the Zoom camera. And so that brought it back, because I sometimes communicate better if I'm just like sketch something out and show it versus like trying to verbally describe it.
Yeah, cool. Okay, this next question, I think you touched on it very slightly, but from Lindsay in the chat's asking, do you automate anything, or is each map built from scratch?
Yeah, there's some people on the team that automate stuff, and I'm not one of those people. It's usually built from scratch, but like I have like a lot of folders of different like shapefile base data. We have base data folders for the team that have like if you all are familiar with natural earth data and just like basic boundaries and rivers and stuff for that, and then bring into QGIS. But if it's mapping in an area that we've mapped before, like sometimes I'll just take that Illustrator file and like update the colors or add different things to it. I do save all my like QGIS files though, and that like if I'm mapping an area that's like in a similar area, sometimes I'll open up an old QGIS file and I will just export from there, start from there. But it's what's helped with like not needing to automate is like the data wrapper aspect for locator maps. So just having that to make locator maps. But from my side, I don't do a lot of automation, and I should. And there are other people on the team who do a lot of automation. But
are there like certain types of projects that are more suited for like somebody to bring in automation, or certain applications that's more prominent in?
Yeah, I think it's more for the like the graphics pieces that we know are going to be like pretty like long term. So we did a lot of that with like COVID data visualizations for like the COVID tracker. A lot of like that's one where there was a lot more automation. So more of those like longer term interactive stuff, because a lot of the stuff we do is kind of I don't know if the right word is like bespoke, but it's like probably this is the only time we're going to use this map. So it's like it is from scratch. But for more of the like longer data tracking stuff, We also have like other long-term pieces that track things like heat waves, school shootings, etc. that have like it's a more like streamlined process because it's stuff that is unfortunately like continuous, and so we're constantly having to update it. Same with like the COVID tracker and things that are like getting updated frequently or have like a long time span. Those are the things that we put a lot of that time into, like automation and building that structure for it. Yeah.
Yeah, Haley has a question here that's in a similar vein, thinking about that in the context of like election maps, she's wondering, if you could just speak a little bit to the technical process for updating maps when data is changing in real time, like the election maps, and how is that approached?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have a very detailed answer because so when I first started the post, we did like our team did a lot of like the election mapping infrastructure and all that stuff. But now we have an engineering team at the Washington Post that does a lot of that like automated infrastructure for like pulling in live data, et cetera. And so I don't know the details on it, unfortunately. But if you would like to email me, I can connect you with someone who would be able to better like describe that, because I don't know all the ins and outs of it because it's moved over to engineering. But previously we used it was like a Mapbox base, and then it like that was projected and then pulled in that way. But they're doing it a bit differently now. So yeah.
Cool. All right. Jessica is asking, how do you depict politically sensitive areas like disputed borders? Are there any special considerations there?
Yeah, there's a lot of special considerations there. So it depends on scale. So obviously, if we're showing the world, we might not show like some, but then as you get closer to like Ukraine, Crimea examples, like a really, really recent one that we always need to make sure like, it's that it's mapped properly. We've also done some pieces like literally the story is focused on like politically sensitive areas. So we have a piece that's mapping like Kashmir and essentially all the different boundaries and all the different and like describing like why that is, the history of it. And so we have done those pieces where it's like the entire story is like on providing our readers with more context to that. When I was at National Geographic, we had like if you look at a National Geographic atlas, all of those disputed boundaries are like noted with like very detailed notes, etc. We can't always add those notes because like on a mobile phone versus an atlas is like there's not a lot of room. And so we try to we add map notes if we need to, but like oftentimes we'll go to like the National Geographic for reference, but we're also referencing like State Department. We're referencing like, what are the different sources, what are the different news, but also we have like a large like copy editing team that is helping make those decisions as well. Same with place names as well. So place name styles, the place names we should be using, et cetera, and using like Board of Geographic names for references and whatnot. So yeah, a lot of my coworker Laris, who I mentioned a couple of times, he's worked at the Post for over 20 years now, and so he's like pretty much mapped everything. And so I've learned a lot from him in terms of like mapping those politically sensitive areas too. But even the other day we had, or a couple weeks ago, we were mapping, Taiwan and showing like where's Taiwan and the different islands versus China, et cetera. So, yeah.
Okay, we got one more in the chat from David. With many steps in the design process, for example, making sure you have an understanding of the material, accurate text and photos, when do you feel ready to design the map itself, and how many iterations do some of the longer term projects go through?
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like the design of the map is just like never, it's just kind of never stopping. Like I was working on one the other day, and I kind of just like, I started in like QGIS. I keep referencing QGIS, but like it's just the GIS software you happen to use. Like we have access to Esri as well, or whatever program you're using to get your spatial data in order. And so typically I'll bring it into Illustrator, I'll design there, and then it kind of goes through iterations. So first I try to work with hierarchy. So I just, what's the most important thing? I just make that bold. Not that that's the final color, but for me personally, I like to just separate it out and then make everything else fall back. And then sometimes I wait to decide on colors and stuff until actually we have like the photography for the article in place, because I like to draw a lot of color inspiration from the photos in the article so that hopefully the map or visual will kind of fit a bit more seamlessly into the story. So that's really helpful. If not, if those aren't available until like the last minute, then I usually try to go for something that feels like thematic. So if it's, obviously rivers, blue, but that kind of stuff. It's just stuff that feels a little bit more closer to like the content of the map. But it's completely iterative, where like sometimes I think I'm done and I look at it and I'm like, I lost what's like the hierarchy here, and so I'll go back. And so it kind of goes in circles. And we also we never make our maps or graphics or anything in the department as in like a vacuum. We're very much like a collaborative critique environment. So like I share it with my manager, but I also share it with, we have like a Slack channel with all the cartographers, and I just like, hey, like I'm looking for edits. And so I really welcome that feedback from everyone. And if 5 people aren't figuring out what the focus of the map is, then the general readership is not going to know either. So it's kind of like a very small technical test group, but it's helpful to like share in all those design aspects. So I try to get that hierarchy down, and then it just kind of circles from there. So it's not a very straightforward answer, but it's kind of like I do it incrementally as I can if I have the time, and sharing it with others is the big one to like continue that design. Yeah.
All right, we've got Laura asking, is there adequate work-life balance figured out for the DataViz team, i.e. not working 24 hours during a hurricane? If so, do you have any tips that your group has done well that you think will work well for others?
Yeah, I keep saying it's good. They're all good questions. But yeah, so when I started at the Post, I was like, oh my goodness, I'm never going to sleep. Everything's news, all this. And we have a really good work-life balance, I have to say, which I think is shocking for a lot of people. But what helps is we have a pretty big team. It was like under 30 people when I started. Now we're at almost 40. So it's grown a lot. But like our managers understand, and like that news is a lot. And if you're just constantly working on news all the time, 24/7, you're going to get burnt out and you're going to leave. And so it's not good for retention. And so we have a lot of people, I mentioned my coworker Laris, who's worked at the Post for over 20 years. And we have like a couple people on the team that have worked at the Post for over 20 years. And, people bounce around to different news orgs and whatnot. But I think one thing that has helped and has kept me at the Post for as long as I have is the work-life balance. So obviously when news happens, we do have to cover it. And I can't, if there's something happens at 4:30, if I need to help with it, I can't necessarily sign off at like 5 o'clock. But what helps is we have comp time. So it's if I'm working like into the night on something, or this big news event happens, I just keep track of that time. I talk to my manager. If anything, our managers are more like, they're always asking like, do you need comp time? You worked extra. Like, how are you doing? And so they check in a lot. So it's a very like, everyone on the graphics team is very much looking out for each other to make sure people aren't getting burnt out, which I think really helps. Also just being honest and like, if I'm taking on all the breaking news graphics for that one event, just saying like, hey, I need help, and like bringing people on. We do have weekend shifts. We do have night shifts that we rotate through on the team. So it's not one person working every weekend. It's not one person working every night. Which I think helps balance it too, so that it's balancing the work, balancing those extra days, etc. But I think just overall, like communication is key in terms of like, hey, I'm really stressed out, or hey, I need help, and communicating that, and also the people on the team being very receptive to that. So understanding, hey, like Lauren needs help, and so like, who's available or whatnot. So just being very like communicative helps, but there are terrible news things that happen, and we do like there was a news event that I worked like 16 hours straight. And so that was very stressful. That was really hard, but like I got that time back later. And that kind of comes with the job, is like we've still got to cover the news, but it ends up balancing out, which I haven't had it like past workplaces. So I feel like the work-life balance is good. And I think it helps having a big team too. So
yeah. A lot of those challenges resonate with me. I appreciate that question, Laura. Okay, I think we're just hitting the end of our time here, so I've got one more question. That'll be the last one. Elmira asks, how much time is devoted to understanding and exploring new data sets and metadata? And how do you manage that when working with more urgent news stories?
Yeah. Yeah, so understanding, exploring new data sets. So I think when it's really quick, if we can have like an expert that we can talk to through the data, or like have like an email conversation about just to verify things, it does take time for people to answer, but it does help with like they're the data experts. And so like with the evapotranspiration index was what I couldn't say earlier that I remembered, but essentially like the data was a lot for me to wrap my head around for like a quick piece on drought. And so I just chatted back and forth with the experts via email and stuff. And like, there's one thing where like the data didn't quite look right. And I was like, hey, is this okay? And they're like, oh, wait, no, let's change something. And then, so it helps to have like that direct line. And like, the more we do this stuff, like a lot of this stuff is cyclical, like hurricanes, drought, etc. And so like every year, sometimes I go back to the same experts. I'm like, hey, remember me? I'm mapping drought again, or like I'm mapping hurricanes again. And it's like, so having like building those lines of communication is really helpful. And sometimes I'll just like, if I don't fully understand the data, or if I don't feel comfortable with it, like I won't use it. And that's kind of the thing with the team too. Like, if we don't fully trust the data source, if we haven't fully vetted the data source, like we're just not going to make that graphic. Like we're not going to use like data that hasn't been vetted, data that we can't get a back check on. And like, sometimes that's a conversation with someone else in the newsroom, like, hey, we can't make this graphic because we're not sure about the data. And that's like, that is something we push for, because we want to make sure that we're vetting that data, we're familiar with the data. But one thing that helps on the team is like some people are more familiar with certain data sets than others. Census data is something I used like in undergrad, but I didn't use a lot until the 2020 census. But we have people on our team that have been working with census data for like years and years. And so there are people that I can also go to that are like internal like experts on that. And we have that for quite a few like data sets that we use pretty commonly. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, well, great. We're at the end of our time here, but it's been really wonderful to hear from you and talk to you today, especially the shared love for rivers. Like, I think that resonates with our group.
I figured. I was like, I gotta get a river map in here.
We're deep in NHD for sure. So yeah, I really appreciate you joining us and taking the time to talk to us today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the invite. It was great to chat with you all. And thanks for the great questions.
Great. Well, have a great rest of your day, everybody.
Thanks.